Steve, why are you running for judge?
Well, Gary, you just asked about having gone through a serious illness, and that does play a role in my decision to run for judge. When I was ill, the community really rose up and supported me. Friends took me to treatment, picked me up, brought me home. When my wife was ill several years ago, the community also really rose up and supported her. So I see running for judge as an opportunity to give back to the community that gave so much to me. So that's one reason. Professionally, I've been a litigator and trial lawyer for 27 years, and a lot of litigators and trial lawyers that I know, the idea of transitioning at a certain point in the career to being the judge, to calling the balls and strikes instead of being one of the advocates can be very appealing. So, professionally, I would call it an aspiration that maybe I've always had. So then you combine that with the illness, and you say, if not now, when? And then lastly, I've always been committed to public service. So I see this as an opportunity to marry my avocation of public service to my vocation of being a lawyer.
What do you see as being the most, in your opinion, the most important characteristic of a judge?
Well, I think that judges should have experience and background as trial lawyers and litigators. That's what I'm running for the position of Court of Common Pleas judge, and that's what judges do. And I think it's important to understand what does a trial judge do. And what a trial judge does is litigation. And we live in Delaware County. It is a large county, third most densely populated county in the state, fifth most populous county in the state, close to 600,000 people. We have a bench of 21 judges, of which there are currently 17 sitting judges, and so that's why there's 4 openings this year. We're a large enough county that the bench is divided into essentially 4 divisions: criminal division, civil division, family law, and orphans court. And in each of these divisions, it's litigation. You have 2 parties. You have the lawyers, who are the advocates, and you have the judge, who, in my view's job is to be the umpire and call the balls and strikes. And when one finds themselves in the Court of Common Pleas, life has thrown you a curveball, just like life threw me a curveball when I was diagnosed with cancer, or in my practice, I represent property owners and insurers of properties that have suffered catastrophes like fires. When one finds themselves in the Court of Common Pleas, again, life has thrown you a curveball, regardless of what division you're in. You don't wake up this morning thinking that you're going to be a victim of a crime, or that you're going to be accused of a crime, and find yourself 6 months down the road in criminal court, either as a witness for the prosecution or as the defendant and the accused. You have your lawyers, they're advocating for you, they're the parties, and you have a judge that you want to listen to the parties, let the parties have their say, let the lawyers do their job, let the lawyers advocate for their clients, and call the balls and strikes. Take civil court as another example. We all drive around, we all think we're good drivers, and we all drive around with car insurance. So you don't think, oh, well, gee, this morning I'm going to be in a car accident. You don't wake up thinking this is the morning I'm going to spill coffee on my lap and rear end the guy in front of me, or this is the morning that the fellow behind me is going to spill coffee on his lap and rear end me, and you find yourself in civil court a year down the road, either as a plaintiff or a defendant in a tort lawsuit. Life has thrown you a curveball. You have a lawyer, the other side has a lawyer. You want to be heard. You want your lawyer to be able to try their case, and you want a judge who's going to listen and call the balls and strikes. And as I said, I've been a litigator and trial lawyer for 27 years. I go to court. I appear for scheduling conferences. I appear for discovery hearings. I try cases. I know what it is to be a litigator and trial lawyer.
Based on your experience, it seems like a natural fit or a perfect fit for you might be civil court of the 4 divisions you mentioned. Is that your preference?
Gary, that's a very good question. The president judge just determines where the other judges, to which division the other judges are assigned. Obviously, my background and experience is in civil law. That's what I've been doing for 27 years. But I do believe that my experience and background is transferable, and I believe I'm prepared to hit the ground running in whatever division I'm assigned. But certainly, my depth and breadth of experiences in civil law, and if I were to be assigned to the civil division, I think again from day one I'd be ready to hit the ground running.
Steve, many from minority communities feel intimidated and helpless by the judicial process. They feel that they are not treated fairly by judges in particular and the legal system in general. How do you plan to address these concerns?
Well, Gary, again, I think that's an excellent point, and I think that the phrase that's being used today is implicit bias, and I think that it's important for a judge to recognize that implicit bias is real. It is something that exists. It's cultural, but you do your best to say it has no place in a courtroom. When you see the woman who represents justice, she's got a blindfold on as she's holding the scales. So it has no place in a courtroom, but at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that implicit bias is something that is real and does exist. And I think that we all need to be aware of that and sensitive to that. I think in my experience in civil litigation, it's important that regardless of from what community one is, that one has an opportunity to be heard and respected, and to allow their lawyer to do their job and advocate for them and be heard and be respected.
Mass incarceration and unfair sentencing has adversely impacted Black and brown communities. How do you feel about sentencing reform and its impact on communities of color?
I think sentencing reform is important. I think we've been dealing with, again, my background is not criminal law, so my this is more of a lay opinion, if you will, than a professional opinion. My background is certainly civil law. I think mandatory sentencing that exists, that comes from the legislature. So the legislature has determined, if you do X, you get Y. Takes a lot of the authority and away from the judge to be able to have some compassion and to be able to listen and to be able to understand why life has thrown this particular person a curveball and to take that into consideration. So I think sentencing reform, which has to come from the legislature, that's certainly not the job of a trial judge. The job of a trial judge is to call the balls and strikes and follow the existing law. That's what the legislature's for. That's what appellate courts are for. But I think that if your question to me really hits on mandatory sentencing, I think mandatory sentencing, is a real issue. But as I said, as a trial judge, you have to follow the existing law. Your hands, in some ways, are tied, and that's what mandatory sentencing has done to trial judges. It's tied their hands so that they cannot take into consideration maybe things that they ought to take into consideration, or or not necessarily ought to take into consideration, but their hands are tied. They can't take into consideration things that they might want to take into consideration.
Steve, the bail bond industry generates about $2 billion a year and impacts disadvantaged individuals. What is your position on eliminating cash bails for certain crimes?
Gary, your question goes to bail and what is and I think is really driving at what is the purpose of bail and why bail exists. The bail bond industry itself notwithstanding, and your comment I think is correct that a lot of what goes into whether bail is required or not required is a legislative issue, not necessarily something that a judge can decide. But the traditional purpose of bail is twofold. One, to ensure that the accused returns to court, and second, safety to protect the public. So with the understanding that my background is civil litigation, not criminal litigation, I think if bail is being, in my view, bail is not intended, should not be punitive. If a person is presented to the court as the accused, has strong ties to the community, they own a home, they have a family, they have a job, they have a business, different factors that say this person is not a flight risk, that should be a consideration. Conversely, if the person who is presented to the court is accused of something for which it was a violent offense, and there's a victim who was seriously injured or otherwise, where a victim of that violence, that mitigates in a different direction. And I think if it, to me, if one again goes back and looks at what is the purpose of bail, and the purpose of bail is to ensure someone returns to court and protect the safety of the community. And if you take those things into consideration, it's not supposed to be punitive.
Steve, Delaware County has been dominated politically by the Republican Party. Democrats now, for the first time in ever, it seems, has an opportunity to reverse that trend. If that occurs, do you anticipate a smooth transition or turmoil?
Well, Gary, you're asking about do I foresee an issue in the courts if
Specifically in the courts.
Specifically in the courts if a Democratic judge or judges are elected. Keep in mind, I'm a Republican running for judge.
That's why I'm asking you.
So
you don't want to elect
so with it. Well, I want qualified judges elected.
Okay.
And I want judges elected who are qualified and who have the experience to be trial judges, because I've been in front of judges in my practice who came to the bench without trial experience, without litigation experience. And as a trial lawyer and a litigator, that's not what you want on the bench. I've been deemed well qualified by the bar, by the plebiscite of the Delaware County Bar Association, by the plurality of those who responded to the plebiscite and provided a substantive response. There's an entity called Martindale-Hubbell that's a national entity that rates lawyers, and the people who are involved in Martindale-Hubbell and rating the lawyers are judges and adverse counsel, not your colleagues. And for many, many years, I've had the highest rating in Martindale-Hubbell, which is called AV. It's an apple, V as in Victor. AV. I've been AV rated by Martindale-Hubbell for many, many years. And again, that's a rating from judges and from adverse counsel. And my experience, my experiences as a trial lawyer and litigator. So I want qualified judges. To specifically answer your question, lawyers are professionals. And I think there's, as a civil litigator, I often have an adversary who becomes my friend, who after a deposition, we might go out for lunch together or have a bite, have a cup of coffee together. And I think that I don't foresee there being, I would hope that there wouldn't be an issue. At all. I think people will respect one's qualifications, respect one's professionalism, and things will move on.
Yaden is a predominantly black community, And if you're sitting here talking to me and knowing that this interview will be posted in our publication as well as online, then what that says to me is that you want Democratic votes, or you want our vote. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said we should vote for the folks that are most qualified for the office. That being the case, the President of the United States of America has really shown a disdain for judges, but in particular those of color, and demonstrates very little respect for women. He also openly violates judicial rulings. I mean, case in point, this hasn't been a judicial ruling, but you just look at the situation in the news right now. While the party he leads, and this is in my estimation, has been craven in their responsibilities to hold him accountable. I can just ramble off a dozen things that if Barack Obama had done these things, or Hillary Clinton had done these things, the attitudes and the positions of those in the Republican Party would be entirely different. And so if our laws do not apply or are being enforced on the President of the United States, the person who's supposed to be responsible for maintaining and upholding our values and traditions, then why should they apply or be enforced on me?
Gary, I think that's it's a good question, and it's a deep question. Let me try and answer it two ways. I mean, you asked about what's going on in Washington, and specifically what's going on in the White House. I'm running for a local office. I'm running to be a judge of the Court of Common Pleas. I don't believe, in my view, what's happening in Washington is not pertinent or relevant to the local races that are on the ballot this year. The ballot this year is Superior Court, Court of Common Pleas, District Attorney and County Council, and in individual towns, commissioners, or township commissioners, supervisors, mayor, depending on whether a town is a township, a borough, a city, and school boards. And I think folks need to I would advocate that folks need to look at these are local issues. We pick up the trash. We plow the streets. We run the schools. What's happening, the issues in Washington are not the issues with which we deal with every day. And what happens locally with your local representatives who are, whether it's a township supervisor, a township commissioner, a mayor, a school board, your county court of common pleas, affects you more day to day. There's a lot of noise in Washington. Both parties in Washington contribute significantly to that noise. And this is a local election. To your question as to the rule of law, what to me, especially as a Jewish American, and here we are in Yaden in a predominantly African American community, what makes America in 2019 different than almost any other country in the world is that we're all Americans based on buying into, based on a philosophy. This country is founded on a philosophy. It's not founded on blood. You, Gary, and me, Steve, we're both Americans, notwithstanding you may be African American, I may be Jewish American. We're both Americans. And the history in Europe is not that. You can live in Germany for 3 generations, but if you don't have German blood in you, some people in Germany, you're not German. You can be a German citizen, but you're not German. You're that's not your bloodline. So that it's part of what makes America unique is the rule of law, and a philosophy that's founded on the Constitution of the United States, that's founded on the philosophy of the founding fathers, many of whom were philosophers. Whether it was the Federalist Papers, Madison's writings and Hamilton's writings, and we all know how popular the musical Hamilton is right now, and it's now playing in Philadelphia. And I think it's an important show for a lot of reasons, not just because it's a great piece of theater and it's very entertaining, but because it speaks to the founding of this country and the fact that this is a philosophy. I have 3 daughters. When my wife was pregnant with my youngest, people, oh, you going for the boy? I said, I'm not, no offense to anybody who has sons. I said, no, I don't want a boy. We have 2 girls. We have all the clothes. We have all the toys. We have all the stuff. I know what I'm doing raising girls. I'm not from landed aristocracy in medieval England. And that's a funny joke, and it was a little kind of quip that I had, but there's some fundamental truth to it vis-a-vis your question of what it means, as to what's going on in Washington and what it means to be an American. No, I'm not landed aristocracy from medieval England. I'm a third generation born Jewish American whose great grandparents immigrated from Russia and escaped the persecution in Russia, and specifically on my father's side, the 1903 pogrom in Kishinev. So there's a lot of flaws in this country, and we're seeing a lot of them right now, frankly, from both sides in the dysfunction in Washington. I'm running for a local office of Court of Common Pleas, and my view of what folks should think about when they go in to vote for judge is this person qualified? Is this the person that I want behind the plate, calling the balls and strikes? Is this person going to do their best to be a fair and impartial umpire, and follow the rule of law and call the balls and strikes? Hear me out as a litigant. Let me be heard. Let me have my say. This is my day to be in court and have my say. Let my lawyer do his or her job and advocate for me, and then follow the law and call the balls and strikes.
Steve, I'm not trying to beat this horse to death, as they say. That's the expression. But when I think about court, and I think most people, when they think about being in court or having to go to court and the judge, they kind of want somebody that they can trust, that they have confidence in. And again, when we look at what's happening on a national level, and you're right, politics is local, but when you look at what's happening on a national level, there are people right now in Yaden that may see this interview and say, he makes sense. I align with his positions. He's probably somebody that I might consider voting for and putting on the bench, right? But then they think about what's happening nationally, and so how do you separate yourself from what is happening now that people can see visibly is not right, especially the attacks against the immigrant community, and which we have a number right here in Yaden. So how do you separate yourself? Better yet, why should I, as a Democrat in a predominantly black community, vote for a Republican or you in general, specifically?
You had 2 questions in there, I guess, Gary, and so
I kind of shift the gears.
You asked about trust and how one deals with that, with what's going on in Washington, and you asked, within this community, within Yaden, a predominantly African American community, a predominantly Democratic community, a community that's predominantly African American, and a community where most of the folks are registered Democrat. Why should they consider voting for me with what's going on in Washington? And in my prior answer, I try to talk about that what's going on down in Washington really doesn't have anything to do with the local race, and one should think about qualifications and what's happening locally. In terms of trust, I think one has to look at qualifications, one has to look at what someone's background has been, and what their what their professionalism is. And again, locally, I would say that if you look into my qualifications, my background, my professionalism, I think I am someone of a person of trust that can be trusted to follow the law and call the balls and strikes. When we talk about what's happening down in Washington, and why should an African American person in Yaden who's registered Democrat vote for me? I'm the most qualified person, and I think I'm the better qualified, and I think I'll be the better judge. If I'm fortunate enough and honored to be elected. We've got a situation where we have a fellow in Washington who can be divisive and polarizing. If one wants to agree with there's a saying: if one wants to agree with the candidate 100% of the time, one needs to be the candidate. I think people need to think for themselves. I would ask people to consider that. I would ask people to consider that merely because one may be a registered Republican doesn't necessarily mean that one voted for the current president. There was a primary. There were other people in the primary. So I think that just like there was a Democratic primary, not everybody voted for Hillary Clinton. She won the primary, but it was quite a contested primary. The Republican primary was quite contested as well. And if one looks at the statistics in both my own town where I live and in Delaware County, a lot of Republicans didn't vote for Donald Trump. One can just look at the statistics and see that. There's other things to being a Republican. Part of it, and I don't like the words conservative and liberal. I think they've become loaded with connotations. I prefer to use the word, when I was on the school board in my town, I preferred to use the word fiscally responsible and socially libertarian. And by that I mean that finding the right balance between the taxpayers and meeting the needs of the students and honoring the excellence of the teachers and trying to find that balance. That's fiscal responsibility. There's not a Democratic way or a Republican way to do that. There's an efficient way to do that. So that's what I mean by fiscal responsibility. And by social libertarianism, what I mean by that is that respect people. This is 2019 in America. There's certain hot button social issues which don't come before the Court of Common Pleas. Fill in the blank hot button social issue is not something that would come before the Court of Common Pleas. Those tend to be federal questions. Legislature passes some law. Someone wants to challenge that law as being unconstitutional. They're challenging that under the federal Constitution. That's a federal question. That's going down to 6th and Market at the federal courthouse here in Philadelphia. That's not going to the Court of Common Pleas.
Hold that thought right there for 1 second. I'm sorry.
No. You want a judge that's going to follow the law and call the balls and strikes in those situations. So you want a judge who's going to call the balls and strikes.
Okay. Steve, how can voters reach you and support your campaign or volunteer for your campaign?
Thank you for asking that question, Gary. If voters are interested in reaching me and supporting my campaign, and you can find me a couple different ways. I'm on Facebook. There's a Steve Gerber for Judge Facebook page. It's an endorsed Republican. Cody Bright is the person who's kind of coordinating the campaign for the Republicans out of media, and if one looks up Delaware County GOP headquarters and asks for Cody Bright, they can get to me through there. If one Googles me, you're going to find me pretty quickly at my law firm in Philadelphia, and you can call me directly. I'm reluctant to put that on the tape, but it's pretty easy to find me.
And finally, in closing, did you have any final remarks, for our viewers and readers of our publication?
Well, Gary, I want to thank you very much for having me. And I think you asked, what do I have any closing remarks? And I do want to thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to make make the connection with you and make your acquaintance. I would ask voters to be thoughtful. I would ask voters not to make a quick judgment based on the fact that I'm a registered Republican. I think we both come from communities and backgrounds where there's been a history of people making quick judgments about us based on how we might appear or what religion we might be. I would ask voters to think, are you kind of doing something analogous when you just assume because someone's a Republican that they think a certain way or that they, believe A, B, or C, in the same way that if someone thinks, that, it makes a quick judgment because somebody happens to be a Jewish American or an African American, and they assume certain things. That goes to something we talked about much earlier in the conversation of cultural bias. And I think that, so what I'd ask voters to do is be thoughtful. And who are who are the folks that are the most qualified to be judges? Who are the folks that have the background and experience as litigators and trial lawyers, who know what an inside of a courtroom looks like, who as a professional, who knows what the job of a judge is, who's been an advocate, who's tried cases, who's been in front of juries, who's done that. I've done that. And so, I'm prepared to do that, and it would be my honor and privilege to serve the people of Delaware County and contribute my talents and experience to serve the people of Delaware County with compassion and integrity.
Steve, it was certainly a pleasure meeting you, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to sit down for Meet the Candidate.
Gary, thank you very much.